And I've entitled this Acting Everything You've Always Wanted to Know But Didn't Know What to Ask. And I take that from a question where I had a student once that I had asked because they hadn't accomplished something. And I said, why didn't you ask the question? And they simply said, I didn't know what to ask. So hopefully this will give you something to think about and an opportunity along the way to ask some questions about it. I'm going to go back again to my favorite adage from Goldman that John mentioned the other night in his PowerPoint as well, because it is so applicable to this particular topic as well, and that is nobody knows anything. Wheeler's caveat to that is everybody knows everything. Now, Goldman is serious, and I am sarcastic, but probably it's one of the places in this industry about which you will not get more information than about acting and how you should do it and what you should do, what you should leave out. And it's all contrary, one to the other. Someone will tell you do this and someone else will tell you don't do that. And I've heard it all along the way, why we should do one thing, why we shouldn't do another thing. And so the practical thing is you really have to start making decisions on your own. I'm going to give you some reasons in the approach that I take. And I will tell you right off the bat that they are highly arguable. There are people that will disagree with me about it. And they're welcome to do that. But these are the fundamentals that I use in my approach on both sides of the camera. And I will tell you that working on one side of the camera is entirely different from working on the other side of the camera and what your expectations and needs are. I remember when I first went on stage, I was 14, I believe, and that was in high school, and I'd gotten the lead role in the school play and playing opposite a senior. So we were doing Arsenic and Old Lace. At that point, as I was learning the skills along the way and being particularly young, you have this feeling that you can do just about anything. Then as you age and you start to learn what you can do and what the limitations are in the industry, you start to think about what you can't do and all the many things that you can't do, which seems kind of contrary to acting. Because the idea of acting first came to me when I was about 11 years old. For some reason, I was thinking about all the things that I wanted to be when I grow up, when I was to grow up at that point. I wanted to be a detective, and I wanted to be a doctor, and I wanted to be an astronomer, and whatever you could think of. One week I wanted to be that, and the next week I wanted to be something else. And for whatever reason, somewhere around 11, I thought, I wonder if I could be an actor, because if I could be an actor, I could be all of those things. Well, it doesn't quite work like that, but at least that was the foundation that I was using to make the basis for this idea of working in the industry and being all things as opposed to having to decide to be this one thing for the rest of my life. So that's kind of where it starts. But getting on the other side of the camera, you see the other perspectives, and you have an entirely different set of needs. And so I've tried along the way to work through what is relevant for both sides to get what we ultimately need to get, and that's certainly the advancement of the story and to work through something for the benefit of the audience. So the thing that first thing that I think is very important is the notion of identifying what acting is. And in the simplest of terms, it's communicating. You are communicating something to another body, a group of people. You are revealing something. In one of my speech classes, I had a student that was giving a speech on gambling. And in the midst of this, he started to tell the story about his father and how his father was having difficulty dealing with this. It had become a problem. And all of a sudden, he stopped and he said, I'm really sorry. I didn't know that I was going to have this kind of a problem with this. And he summoned it back up and finished the speech. So fine. So then he sits down. We finish the rest of the speeches. And at the end of the speeches, he raises his hand and he said, you're an acting teacher, aren't you? And I said, I do teach an acting class. And he said, how was that? He said, my father doesn't have a gambling problem. And I said to him, well, let me give you the difference between acting and lying. Because lying is meant to conceal, acting is meant to reveal. When you're acting, the audience is in on it. When you are lying, the idea is to prevent the audience, whoever that might be, from knowing that you are in fact not telling the truth. So acting isn't really lying because the audience is in fact in on it. They understand what you're doing. And they're part of the process, which is something that we'll talk about. But I certainly want to get to the notion of the idea that acting is communication, that you've got a responsibility. The question is, how do you go about doing that? What are the things that you have to consider along the way to do that? Someone has once said that there's only three important things that you have to learn about acting, and that is know your lines, show up on time, and hit your marks. And there's something to be said for that in its simplest form. Very critical, knowing your lines, not wasting other people's time. You have to come to set prepared. That's a respect that you give to your other actors. If you can't respect them, if you can't be ready, then you need to find something else to do. I can tell you that when I see an actor do that, you make a mental note, not working with them again, because there is just too much time. Several years ago, John Spencer, who has since passed away, worked on The West Wing, was in town. They were doing an episode, and I was called upon to meet him to rehearse a scene that he would need to do back in L.A. He was always about the task and about being prepared. And so I went down to his hotel room. We sat around. We talked more about acting than we actually rehearsed, but we did get to that eventually. And one of the things that he complained about were actors who had been bestowed this wonderful opportunity, in some cases semi-regular kind of work, and yet would not come to set ready to go. That there was always a struggle. We were always waiting around for them. And the curious thing is that those characters sometimes leave in a variety of different ways. The character gets sick, the character gets another job, the character dies. All of those things can happen when people are tired of those kinds of antics. There's a great expectation that you will come prepared to do the work that you've been engaged to do, period. Showing up on time, we have a little adage that we use, is to be on time is to be late. The idea is that you're ready to go at that time, that you're not coming in at that time, because that means that you're going to take extra minutes in order to prepare, and we don't have time for that. We've got to get to it when we can get to it. So it's the same kind of thing. It's the respect that you pay other people for their time, because there's a lot of people that are put to work making a lot of money in this process, hopefully. And you don't want to be wasting that money or wasting that time or cause those people to wait for you to do something else. And hitting your marks basically is knowing what you're supposed to do. And for some actors, when you get to a certain place, particularly if it's episodic television, for instance, there's an expectation that you were cast. Let's say that you're not a regular, but you're coming in, that you're cast for it. You know what you're doing. You know how to make the delivery. And in those kinds of cases, my entire direction has not been anything about character. It's been, all right, you're going to walk through the door on this line, you go over there, you say that line, someone else comes in, you turn around, you come back, and you leave. And you may want someone to say, well, what do you want this character to be like? What should he do? And you're not going to get that. You're going to get hitting the marks, finding out along the way. And it's important to understand all that you need to do and what you don't need to do and what it's not about. I had a audition once for a film, and I was being called in for a butler. And naturally, I wanted to be the best butler that they could possibly be. Not Rhett Butler, but a butler. And so, as I'm going over my lines, I have to open the door, and there are some teenagers there who want to see the teenager who lives at that home. And so I'm asking the casting director, so let me ask you a question. Is this butler kind of put off with these kids, that they're bothering him, or is this butler just kind of nonchalant about it? The casting director sat there and said, "He's a butler. Okay, is it Butler? I get it. I was putting too much import on this particular role. This role was window dressing. This role could have been a new model or fancy automobile sitting in the driveway. That's all it was. It was to indicate that this family had money. It had nothing to do with me. It had very little to do with the role or the manner of delivery. It was just a matter of not getting in the way and not interfering with what the story was, which was to identify the money in the household. That's all it was. And so it's very important for actors to understand what their role is. And I don't mean the name on it, but what their function is within the context of the story. Now, if that role were showing, that scene was showing, and I'd be saying, this is my scene coming up. And of course, we know to what extent that would amount to. Do the job. This would be probably good to apply in any business that you're in, any industry you're in. For me, if I'm hiring, it's okay if you say no, because I hire talent and I hire crew on occasions. So if you can't do it, that's fine. There's no hard feelings about that. I realize that people are working and there are other opportunities that come up. And if you're in the freelance business, many things will happen for you, hopefully. So I'm not concerned about the no's. What I am concerned about is someone who says yes, and then a better job comes up, and then they come back and they say, oh, I'm terribly sorry, I'm not going to be able to do that now. That I have a problem with. And if I know that's going to happen, that's it for us. Because when you tell me something, I expect that to be it, and you're going to take that job and do the job. Otherwise, I wish you well and hope that you're going to be very successful doing those other things you're doing. Just say no to me, but not yes and no, not maybe. I need to know what the answer is, and that's very important when you're casting. I have a friend who name's John Strawbridge, and he's written a book called The Audition Book, which is everything that you always wanted to know about casting, but didn't know what to ask. And he talks about, because he'd been in the business for a number of years, about music and how music is oftentimes between the notes. It's not necessarily the note, but it's what happens in between. And that's oh so true about acting. It's not just the lines, it's what happens between the lines. It's how you wait, and particularly, it's how you listen. We're auditioning, and certainly after you've been cast, I want to see that you are listening to the other character, that you're not just waiting to say your line. Alec Baldwin, I think this is from the movie State and Maine, talks about how an actor reads a script, and he looks through the script and he says, my line, BS, 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 my line, BS, my line. As if to say, the only important lines in the script are the ones that you have. And sometimes performances come off that way. It's as though the actor is waiting for the next cue as opposed to even having any idea of what's going on. They're not listening. They're not really thinking about anything. They're simply remembering their own line. Now, they may deliver it with feeling, but frequently that's out of context of what the scene is meant to deliver. So we see it first in audition process, because someone is given a script and they'll read through the script and they'll deliver the line. So let's say they have a block of line and there are 3 sentences. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean you start on the first word of the first sentence and then plow straight through and not take a break until the last word of the last sentence. When we have conversation with people, when we're talking, every now and then we pause. We give ourselves an opportunity to think. We give them an opportunity to think, to catch up on whatever it is that we've said. And that's true with dialogue. You won't always find dialogue that will read, pause here. You've got to do that job. And there's nothing that shows greater control, whether this be in acting or in presenting a speech, for instance, than to be able to speak and stop and then start and deliver again. Because that shows that you have control of the situation, that you're not lost, that you haven't gone up on a line, but that you are there. You're thinking about what the character is saying. You're thinking about what the other character is saying in return. If any of you have taken the class on listening, listening also sometimes part of the speech class, there's a woven Coakley model about what happens in listening. And 3 stages. The first stage is called receiving it. The second is attending to it. And the third is assigning meaning. And that's what should happen throughout the course of any kind of dialogue, that those 3 things are going to happen. The other day I was sitting in a eye doctor's office, just sitting there waiting, so I had papers with me to grade. So I grade everywhere. Grade, 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 grade. So I'm sitting there grading, and there's a video that's playing talking about vision issues of sorts. So I hear that, and I'm trying to put that out of my mind. And after a few minutes, I realize that I am well into thought, and I have stopped even hearing that video until I start and listen for it again, and I think, all right, they're speaking again. So the first thing in listening is the receiving it. That is, that you hear words are being said. They're being directed in some fashion. Otherwise, it becomes pretty much like the kid in the cartoon who's listening to the teacher, and the teacher just sounds like, wah, wah, wah. They're not even hearing the words. So you've got to hear words being said first. So you hear those words, and then you start attending to it. Well, as I'm writing, as I'm grading, I hear that words are being said, but the words are all meaningless to me now because I'm not attending to it. So now I have to attend to the words. What are the words actually saying? What are the words being said? And then I have to assign meaning. So what does that mean to me? It's in reference to my eyes. I can give that some consideration, just as when we have a dialogue, 2 people have dialogues, there's the receiving it, there's attending to it, and there's assigning meaning, because sometimes you might ask somebody else, well, what do you mean by that? And then the other person has to explain what that is. Somewhere along the line, you have to have some kind of agreement as to what the meaning is that's being said. You find that frequently at issue when you're exchanging by way of email, because there's no inflection. We don't have any intonation, and you don't know if someone is being, cute in their answer or they're being sarcastic in their answer. I have a tendency, because of having so many emails, to be kind of to the point, and I think that sometimes people will read into that incorrectly, that that I'm not interested or that I'm very hurried. I do have a lot to deal with, so I don't want to linger on it, but I want to get the point across, because it's important to me that you get the answer to that question. So if it comes across in any kind of way as being kind of abrupt, it's not meant that way at all. But we will never understand that in regards to emails. We will only understand that when we have the opportunity to speak face to face, and then you hear some kind of inflection or intonation that helps to define the meaning. Now, another thing that you would learn in the listening class is that when you are attending to someone, you're still only getting about 50%. That means in a class, if you're sitting in a class and you actually are attempting to pay attention, 50% of that material is coming in, 50% of it is gone. So you have to figure out what it is that needs to be done, both you and your instructor for that matter, what needs to be done to kind of make up for that other 50%. But as far as acting goes, what we want to do is entertain the thought that that process has to happen. Even though you know the line, you may know the other person's line. There's a commercial right now I see for one of the phone companies, and there are 2 people sitting on a park bench playing zombies. And the female says, some of us kill some zombies and some of us feed them. And the guy says, I like to win. And there's an older woman sitting next to him, and he turns to her and she says, you like to whine. And as she's saying whine, his mouth is mouthing the words, because he knows the words. Who knows how many times they've done that. But he goes, and I'm thinking, why they never caught that? But you learn one another's lines, and it's got to be the point where you're listening. You're not expecting that, but you've got to be portraying as though you're listening to that answer, and from that you're getting some information. Would the lines indicate that feeling? I think what you're asking is if it's in the dialogue. It's not necessarily always in the dialogue. And I think I may have mentioned this in a class once where sometimes the writer gets it correct. And particularly as far as training films are concerned, because usually in a training film, for instance, there's someone in the audience represented in that training film, someone who has to give the opposition argument. And that's the person you want to reach, the people that are reluctant to the change, whatever the change is. So the line, for instance, in a couple occasions I've been in situations where the line appears to be very argumentative, and I've mentioned to the writer director, this is the audience, correct? And very specifically, and I apologize if I'm repeating this, if I told you the story in class, but the writer director said, yeah. I said, so you don't want him to be too argumentative, because otherwise the audience member that he represents will be perceived as being somewhat the same way, and those people then will be turned off because it's as though you're painting them as being, foolish in some way for not just jumping right on the bandwagon and going along with this. The fact that they have an opposition point of view, you're dismissing them if I'm so argumentative. Yeah. So what you see is sometimes the words are right, and sometimes the words can lead you down the wrong path. You need to know what has to be communicated. You're hoping that you're going to get that from the director, but sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have to bring that to the table. And you ask those questions. You ask those questions about how you want it to be played. And I would tell you sometimes the director says, yeah, I don't know. Let's see what you do with it. So then you have to go with it. One time I was auditioning for this was another training film, and we were auditioning in pairs, and it was to be a silent movie bit. And I said to the actor that I'm working with, I said, so we're going to amp this up just a little bit, as it might be in a silent film. And we go in, we're the first ones to audition. We said to the writer director, I guess you want this kind of approaching, going over the top a little bit because it's a silent bit. And he said, oh, no. I want you to play this very straight, very, matter of fact on the delivery. Okay, so I just look at my partner and let's do this. So we did it, played it very dry. And when we were finished, the director said, yeah, let me see that over the top once, just see what you do with it. And so we did it the way that we had rehearsed outside, and came in, amped it up quite a bit, and we were cast, and that's the way we did it. So again, writer-director kind of got the material right, knew what had to be included as far as content, but wasn't certain about the delivery, what the context of the delivery, even though this was their concept. And so you've always got to challenge things. You've always got to wonder in a polite way, what's the best way to do it? Because that may be the difference between you getting the job or someone else thinking of it and getting the job after you, because all you did was, what was expected or what the director was asking, as opposed to trying something, or at least clearing that out. Some directors are much more interested in collaboration than others. There's some that have a specific vision and will kind of almost give you the reading. This is the way I want you to do this. I know what the story is. I know exactly how I want it to work. This is the way you do it. Others will ask you, so tell me, what do you think about this character? What do you think that they want to do? How do you think that they would behave? You've got to decide how much time you have and what best serves the task, particularly from your style of directing. The butler could do that if that was significant, but it wasn't significant. And if I had done that, that would have been more or less taking something into the scene that didn't need to be there. It wasn't about the butler. It was about the butler as an idea, had nothing to do with any of the lines, had nothing to do with any of the facial expressions. Answer the door, invite the boys in. That's it. That's all it was about. The thing, when I'm talking about the audience, and certainly doing this for the audience and communicating, and I think this is a critical thing for me that I think is frequently left out of the equation, and that is there's an audience. And the audience is responsible for part of the performance. So that if you are, in a strange way, I mean, it almost sounds contradictory, but if you complete the performance, you've almost taken the audience out of the mix. They don't get to contribute in any way. And one of the earliest examples of this, if we go back to Lev Kuleshov, it's you can look this up, you can YouTube this. There are many examples of this. Other people have done this. And he was a Russian filmmaker, and he did an experiment where he took an actor, and he has the actor, he just shot some film of the actor just looking straight at the lens. And then he shot some other things. He shot a picture of a bowl of soup, a child in a coffin, a picture of a bride, obviously ready for her wedding. And there are variations of this depending upon which story that you hear, what three items that they used. But the idea was he then juxtaposed the same image of this actor with these three things and showing them to different audiences. So the interesting thing about film is that you create these higher meanings that, as it's been said, greater than the sum of their parts. So you have a picture of an actor, just a serious look on his face, almost really blank, and you put that next, the scene or the shot that we see next is a bowl of soup, and the audience said, "Wow, how hungry that guy looks." And then you show the same actor and you juxtapose it with the scene of the child in the coffin, and that audience says, "How affected he is, how tenderly he's looking at that child that he's probably lost." And then the bride, and how the actor looked at the bride with such love in his heart. And it's the same shot. The actor's not doing anything. But the audience brought something to the table. And when we exclude them from the process, they may not enjoy it as much. They may not be as affected as much when we leave them out of the equation. So you really have to think of what you need to do to communicate that involves the audience, not something that keeps them at a distance. And that's a very hard thing to do, because when you're working roles and working characters, you're very often thinking about yourself. You know, what would my character do? What would my character say? Even out of context of the story. It suddenly becomes, the movie in your mind becomes about your character than it is about what the story is really about. And that's a problem. So go to YouTube, look at Kuleshov. There was another great scene from Queen Christina with Greta Garbo years ago. And this is at the end of the movie. She has, I'll give you the ending, I'm terribly sorry, but she's lost the love of her life, has just died on this boat, and they're getting ready to sail out, and she's walking to the bow of the boat, kind of looking off into the distance, wherever it is they're headed. And the director told her, "I don't want you to do anything. I don't want you to think about anything. I just want you to, you're going to walk out here. The only thing I don't want you to do," I believe that he said this, is blink. It's interesting how blinking can really break down the connection with the audience. So depending upon what you need to do, and I'm not saying you never blink in a movie, I'm just saying there are times when not blinking keeps the connection and blinking interrupts it. So anyway, walk out there, don't blink, and just look off into the distance. And I can't remember, there may have been a blink in there. But for the most part, it's just nothing going on. But because of what has just happened, that we've just seen, and we just look at her face, and we kind of see the loss, the turmoil, and we're doing that. She's not doing that. She's not doing anything. We're the ones that are doing that. So you always want to make sure that you keep the audience involved. Don't take it away from them. They want to be there. They're part of the process. The suspension of disbelief. They go to the movies. They're putting aside the fact that you're not really that person, but they're willing to accept you in that role for that period of time. They're suspending that. And your objective is to do, what John had on one of his slides. Don't mess it up. They're on board. So in some cases, the least you do, the less chance you have of messing that connection up. It's interesting to see some directors get to the place that they understand that it's not about realism, it's about believability. We don't have to be realistic. We just have to be believable. Now, you might be asking, what's the difference in that? Well, let me give you a scene, one that I've auditioned for, and I know others have had the same kind of reaction. Auditioning for an emergency room doctor. Someone's been shot, a regular on the series has been shot, so you go in, you read it. Now, the reality of that situation, if you've ever been in an emergency room, is things are fairly controlled. They can't get out of hand. You can't panic. You start panicking, you start losing patience. So you've got to know what your job is and be very firm and deliberate about what it has to be done. And that doesn't mean that you take your time, you relax. There has to be a sense of urgency about it, but nevertheless it has to be controlled. So you go in and you read the lines that way because that's your understanding of the reality of the situation. But the story is not about the reality of the situation of an emergency room. It's about somebody's just been shot and a series regular has been shot. That's got to be dramatic. If we play that under control, the message that we send the audience is not to worry, things are under control, he'll be okay. But if we play that higher than what we otherwise would normally do in reality, but focus on the believability, we create a sense of panic in the audience that this guy might die, that his life is at risk. And so what you're working for is what serves the story. It's always going to be what serves the story. It's not going to be about that's how it really is. What is it that you need to tell the audience, and how do you want the audience to react in some situation? That's what you have to focus on along the way and make sure it works. So that requires, consideration of the audience, not just the characters in the scene or how you would do it or what you would bring to the table. Well, if I was a doctor, I would do it. It's nothing about that. What does the audience have to get? What's the story about? Several years ago, I passed the script around in class, and I worked on a film project and had the pleasure, however briefly, working with the late Sidney Pollack. And we were doing a scene. I was playing the coroner in this scene at a news conference about the plane crash that occurs in the film. And our scene was going to be, don't look for it, our scene was going to be placed on a screen that Harrison Ford was going to be watching the news report of this. But we had to do the whole thing to play on there. So he's hired, in addition to actors playing some of these roles, some newscasters, some local newscasters, to deliver the lines. They're questioning the people there to give information about this crash. And so he comes into the room and he says, all right, let's rehearse the scene. Go ahead, start, give me your line. So this newscaster asks the question, and he says, no. He says, you're acting. And what are you acting in here? Just ask the question. So the newscaster gets another shot at it, and once again says, no. You're acting. All I want you to do is ask the question. You do this every day. Just ask the question. Let me have you, all right, you say your line, so he turns to another newscaster. He's got the second question. And he offers the question, and then Sidney says, no, you're doing the same thing that she just did. Look, I don't want any acting in here. Just say the lines. And so what's running through my mind is I finally get to work with Sidney Pollack, and I don't want him to talk to me. Because he's going to say, just say the lines. So fortunately, my line was all right. My delivery was fine. But I knew exactly what was happening because it wasn't their line. It wasn't something that they had made up. It was something that was coming off a script. And so that's a different place in the mind that you have to go to make that sound natural, as opposed to something that you just thought up, rather than something that's been scripted for you and you're reading that line. And that comes after the listening aspect of it that I mentioned, those three stages. Because what happens in the brain is you have a reaction and a response. So I'm saying something to you right now, and wherever you are in your homes, you're having a reaction to it. Now, the response might be, "Ah, that's interesting," or "Is dinner ready yet?" Or, "Oh, that reminds me of a question." You can have a number of different responses, but in your mind, you've got to get to that point where you've assigned meaning, and then you have a reaction, which is nonverbal usually, and then the response. Now, the response can also be nonverbal, but it can also be a question in some fashion. So that's what has to happen. You've got to get to that place and make it seem that way. You've got to almost back the line up, not just say words coming out of your mouth. So, ultimately we did get through the scene without any problem. It was just the idea that, all you've wanted to do is act, and someone comes in and says, "No acting in here." There is an interesting consideration about camera position, how close the camera is to the talent, because that's different now than what you're going to find theatrically. When you're in a theater watching a stage show, you are some distance from the performers. So the performers have to be somewhat exaggerated. And again, that's going to depend on the nature of the task and whatever the show is as to how much they're going to be, because they have to be seen. They're not going to be seen as close up as we are if we're doing a close up. And I remember reading some years ago an actor, Richard Crenna, who has since passed away, and worked with another actor, long gone, Walter Brennan. They had done a show together back in the 60s called The Real McCoys. And Crenna, you may know from some of the Rambo pictures. He played the Colonel in the earlier Rambo pictures. But he said that Brennan had taught him there are, three placements of acting. There's long shot acting, there's medium shot acting, and there's close-up acting. And every time the camera gets closer, you take it down a little bit lower, a little bit slower, not necessarily slower, but you want not to amplify that too much because we're right there, we're right in your face, we can see all that. If the camera's a distance away, then there are going to be things that we're going to have to do with a little more exaggeration, only to be seen. And that would be the same thing that we would be doing on stage. Subtle kinds of things. It still has to match if we're cutting from that long shot to a close-up. But nevertheless, if the whole thing's going to be in a long shot, there's got to be more exaggeration to it than it is when we're up close. So you need to know where the camera is. An actor really should know what their framing is. I always tell people that are taking our class, if you go in for an audition, you need to know what your frame is and ask that question. Because if you don't know, you may be doing things completely out of frame. For instance, if I'm gesturing here, you're not seeing any of that. So if I know what my framing is, which is I can see it, I know where to keep my hands, and beyond which you're not going to see it all. So it's important to understand what your framing is. And I noticed that the opposite can also work. If you've got an actor who is really too much in close-up, and they can't seem to bring it down, that's a problem that you should have known in casting, then you move the camera back. You back the camera up, and when you move it further away, even though their performance level is the same, it will seem more realistic because we've created now some distance between us and the actor in order to accomplish that task. So know your framing and know where the camera is. Anyway, the next thing that I want to talk about has to do with what the specific job is of the talent and what they have to be aware of. And that's knowing, again, what their role is and whose scene it is. If you put an actor in a scene, it's their scene. It doesn't matter what role it is. At least that seems to be the perspective that many have. And so you really got to bring them to task sometimes and understanding this is your job. If you're a supporting actor in a scene, your job is to support. What is it that you have to do for the benefit of that lead, or if it's the next tier actor, whatever the case may be. You have to understand what that scene is about. It's not just to say those lines. You don't just come in and say those lines. You don't come in and manufacture a backstory that has nothing to do with whatever the context of the real story is. And you might say, well, I need to do that to get to a place, and we'll talk about that. But you need to do whatever is necessary for that scene. I was in an audition recently, and I realized that this was a low budget film, but I realized that the role that I was auditioning for was a supporting role, obviously, and the actor or the role that I'm reading opposite to is the lead. And the director was giving me some direction as to what he was thinking about for this role. And the thing that I really wanted to ask him was, yeah, don't tell me about my role. Tell me about the lead role. What is it that you need the lead role to reveal to the audience as a result of the scene? Because that's what I need to know to determine how to play it. I can play this scene, a number of different ways that could be believable, but it's not going to deliver what that actor needs in order to advance the story. So it's very important that you know what the lead has to do. Where is it going? It's kind of like charting. Two things you need to chart a course. You need to know where you are and where you're going. And it's the same thing in story. Sometimes, some people will write because they want to discover the story along the way. Others know this is where it's going to end up. When I'm breaking down monologues, I usually tell people, well, you're going to have to read it through, but you have to get to the end before you make any decisions about how to begin the monologue, because you have to know where you're going. If you don't know where you're going, how can you do anything? How can you make any intelligent decision along the way? It's just going to be stream of consciousness for the most part, and it doesn't mean that you're going to wind up any particular place. It's kind of the Cheshire Cat saying, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. You have to know where you're going in order to accomplish that task. So know what your job is in the context of that scene and know whose scene it is. And if you're a supporting actor, it's probably not yours. Actors' tools, though, while you're bringing this up, it's important to understand what the actors' tools are, and those would be voice, physicality, and timing, because acting is not just three-dimensional, it's four-dimensional. It happens over a course of time for the most part. So voice, what are you going to do with your voice? Learning, again, inflections, intonations, what do those things mean? The physicality, how your body stands, what are you communicating in a nonverbal fashion? To amplify, not to detract from that. And it's very important understanding that, because some actors, it's simply a matter of a subtle movement where leaning in means something more than back. You can deliver the same line, but coming in, going back are two different things. From a photographer's perspective, I've always been curious about how people interact when I'm posing them. If I pose couples, do they lean in or do they lean away from each other? Sometimes that can be telling. So you learn to pick up on those cues and see how people are communicating in that fashion. And then those are things that you can apply. Those are not things that are necessarily going to telegraph it, but people are going to get a sense of something along the way, and they understand what that means. It can be the way you turn your head, the way you tilt your head. And those are things also learned from a photographic standpoint as far as posing is concerned, how to be how to understand what is the more dominant position, what is an inferior position. Just like we talk about camera angles, whether it's a low angle or a high angle, all that is going to have an impact on performance. So voice, physicality, and then timing. Timing being, particularly important in comedy. But, waiting when you're going to give them the punchline, how you're going to think about something. When you come back with the next line. In theater, you'll frequently hear people will say something about, pick up the cue, pick up the cue. They want you to come in a little bit faster. But in film, you don't have to worry too much about that. As long as we see that you're engaged, we won't think that you are falling behind. And the other thing is we can edit for the most part. So if you leave us a little space, we can bring that together and tighten that up as much as we need to be. Now, if you're in too fast, then it's difficult to separate those things, and we may be stuck with you coming in on top of somebody else, unless we've asked you to repeat and do that line again in some fashion. So those are the three primary tools that you'll be working with as an actor. Another thing that's important when you're writing to consider this, not only just as an actor, but when you're writing, is that character is revealed through relationships for the most part. You don't necessarily find a lot of character when a person is by themselves. You find the character in how people relate to other people. I'll give you an example of this and how it can be confounded sometimes. So in case one of my good friends is watching this, she was doing a role a number of years ago playing Nancy in Oliver. And there was an interesting thing that she did, because when her significant other comes on stage, who is the heavy in Oliver, and everybody cowers, everybody that's in the tavern cowers that he's come on, and she did this. And it was very curious to me. And afterwards I asked her, well, why'd you do that? And she said, well, the director wanted Nancy to be strong. And I said, oh, okay. It's very, very interesting. Because what you've done is demean the other character. Because we're going to take our lead from you. You're the girlfriend. You know this guy better than anybody else. And you're going, pfft. And so he's nothing. We shouldn't be afraid of him. Everybody else is the other message is that everybody else is, mistaken. They're foolish for acting that way around this guy because he's nothing. The thing that I further went on to say was that the thing where courage is revealed is usually by doing something that you're afraid of. And Nancy has great courage at the end of the show because she steps out onto that fear and does something anyway at the end to save him. And without that, if she's brave from the beginning, then there's nothing special about what she does at the end. So you always need to know what's the purpose of your character in revealing something about someone else, and does it contribute to the story? I understand what that director was trying to do, and directors are free to make the interpretation that they want. I'm just explaining to you why I thought that was a serious mistake to do it in that particular way, because Nancy ultimately makes the ultimate sacrifice and shows the greatest amount of courage because she was afraid, not because she wasn't. So again, understanding what your job is. Let me talk briefly about internal acting as opposed to external acting. There are method actors where they get greatly involved in the context of what that particular job or character would be involved in. They want to live it. They want to see what it's like. And I get that. There are other actors that come from the school of behaviorism. I want to know what I can do physically to send that message that the audience gets. I don't necessarily have to feel it as long as they read it. And I'm more subscribed to the second portion of that. Method acting to me seems to be therapy, I think, to some extent. So I've just insulted every method actor out there. I apologize for that. But I'm not a big believer in it, that it's a necessity. In fact, if anything, I think to some extent it becomes more difficult to work with that kind of actor on set because I just want you to do the job and move on with it. I don't want to have to deal with a whole lot of what you did to get to that place. I just want you to get to that place and communicate it in some fashion to the audience. And I think that's the thing that best serves time and congeniality in some cases to a great extent. There are many fine actors who have gone through the method process. And, I can't argue it from their standpoint. Some people need to do that. I just don't do that. And even as I was telling somebody the other day about this, sometimes people will say, well, let's go back to the feelings. You got to bring up a feeling that you had some time ago that was maybe a tragic event. You want to think about that. And I thought, you know, there's two problems with that. The one is, if we're doing this repeatedly, let's say it's for a stage show, at some point you're going to desensitize yourself to that event. It's no longer going to have an impact. And I said, you know, if I were to bring up a tragic or a sad event in my life, it would have been at the death of my father and the circumstances about that. And that's significant to me. And some of it hurts, and I don't want it to be desensitized. I don't want to lose that, because that's part of him. That's part of our last time together. And so I want to hold on to that, not lose that. So I don't want to go there in order to make that happen. So I want to find something else that I could use on a repeated basis. And repeatability is key to your performance as an actor. You have to make a choice to do that. I was doing a commercial once for Bob's Big Boy.
We admit there are other ways to eat breakfast for under $3. But why not come to Bob's Big Boy, where you can get any of these 4 breakfasts for just $2.99? It's up to you.
Well, a sugar pop will bounce where a sugar pop wants to bounce. Now, they wanted it to bounce forward because the camera's right there on the edge of the table. So one time it hits here, it goes that way. Another time it's here, it goes that way. Sometimes they get a face full of milk. You got to towel off. You got to do it again. So each one of my takes has to be the same. I've got to hit the mark every time, time it for the 24 seconds so that it's all on there, because we're all waiting on this sugar pop. And when the sugar pop does its roll right and rolls forward, then we've got it. So 42 times we did that scene in order to make that happen. And it can't be one of those things where, well, this time you did it this way and that time you did it that way. Once you've established what it is, that's the way it has to be. Making choices in order to do that are important. In my acting class, usually after the first week, after the first night, I will give students a monologue. It's a monologue that I've written. And I will tell them, I want you to take this home and you're going to perform this monologue. I don't want you to memorize it. That's the only instruction. Now, what I want to see them do is what they do with it. If they know that I've written it. So did they contact me during the week to get any kind of information, or did they just let it go? I want to see what kind of initiative they have. So I remember one week, next week came back, 3 of them performed it, and I asked this one young lady, well, I asked them all this, so tell me what you did to prepare for this. How much time did you spend on it? And one young lady said, well, you told us not to memorize it, so I never looked at it again. I said, oh, you never looked at it again? No, I wanted it to be fresh. Okay, I gotcha. Well, it was raw. And there's a difference between fresh and raw. Raw is, right out of the can. Well, that may not be too raw. That could be, since it's canned, maybe right out of the ocean, as it were. But fresh is something that it has to be every single time you do it. Performance after performance after performance. If it's 8 times a week, for 24 weeks, that's what it needs to be. And you can't make it fresh if you haven't made a choice, if you haven't studied and understood what it's about. So that's going to put time and effort into it that otherwise is lost, and it'll just be raw. It won't be fresh. So being able to repeat something, it's necessary to make a choice. You can't repeat it if you haven't made a choice. And I've seen actors do that, where we'll do the take again, and the next take it's entirely different, and it's a monster to edit. It's unbelievable trying to find things that match, because one time they were looking here and another time they were scratching their face, another time they were looking down, and it's all at the same point in the delivery of the line. I'm thinking, I got to pick one of these because I can't cut from a 2-shot to a single because they don't match anymore. So that's why it's important to make the choice and repeat that choice as much as possible. Well, I'll tell you, as far as the gesticulations are concerned, uh, probably the thing that's most important in life, not just in acting, is to believe behavior rather than words. These people lie. I don't know if you've ever watched House, but people lie. And sometimes characters lie. But it's very difficult to lie behaviorally. So if you pay attention to what people do, as opposed to what people say, you will be much closer to the truth. And it's the same thing with acting. If your behavior is off, it doesn't matter what you say, people are going to believe what you do. They're going to watch what you do. And that's the thing that's going to be convincing to them, not anything that you say. So, yeah, you have to be very careful about that and make sure it matches and amplifies the message as opposed to contradicting the message, which is not necessarily the line. The line may not be the message. You have to know what the message is. It's funny in most of those cases, as far as it's understanding how your face works and knowing what people will react to, more necessarily than actually feeling the real emotion. There's a play called Love Letters, which I've done, and to describe this is always the fascinating thing to me. To describe this play, it's like no one would ever come see this, but it's just two people, man and a woman, who are reading these letters that they've written to each other over about 40 years. So it starts out as a child, maybe about 10 years old, and then they get up into their early 50s. And you would think that's got to be extremely tedious. Well, I guess it depends on how you do it. And the times that we've done it, we've tried to really suggest, even though we're adults, suggest the age and the mannerisms of the child, not overdoing it, but making changes in the voice. The voice is going to be a little higher, when you're younger, and a little faster, and then it's going to slow down and deepen as you get older along the way. So trying to do subtle things, different things that you would do with the body to suggest this. At the end of this play, and these are two people that have been in love with each other effectively their entire lives, but they can just never get on the same page at the same time. When one's in love with the one, the other one's busy about something else, and when she's in love with him, he's busy with something else too. So they can never get together, but they are the love of each other's life. They're just with different people. And so at the end of the play, she's gotten to a place where she's been depressed and she's done. And she writes him a farewell letter. And he wants to get to her before she does anything, and he doesn't. He doesn't get there in time. So his last letter is sort of to her, but it's really to her mother, where he confesses what she's meant to him, everything that she's been throughout their life together. And so he struggles with that. And when I'm doing that show, it's the struggle. It's not, you don't cry. You try not to cry. It's like being drunk. Depending on how drunk it is, a lot of people, they'll just do sloppy drunk. But for the most part, you're trying to be sober. If you're drunk, you're trying to act sober as best as you possibly can. So you almost do the opposite thing. So if you know what you can do facially and in the manner and how you present things and what happens to your voice and those kinds of things, you can affect that. And every time we do that show, I've had, the men start to cry in the audience. And I've always, when I first started doing it, I thought, well, I believe that the women will react very favorably to this. And suddenly I was getting, my gosh, everybody's crying. This big old tough guy in the audience is crying. And here I'm thinking, who would want to see this show where people are just reading to each other for an hour and a half? And yet it works to tremendous effect. I mean, it's a great show, potentially. I can't say it's always done well, at least from my perspective, I guess. But you fight whatever it is that you're trying to do, and the audience will respond. The audience will feel that, and then they will react accordingly. No, you have no idea as far as what you're in for to become an actor, because it's a different road for everybody. But one of the things you have to know is understand who you are, where you fit. There's the old notion about two types of casting: typecasting and bad casting. And that's the thing that's probably the biggest struggle, because you really think, well, I can do anything and everything, but you're only going to be cast for certain things. I mean, look at me now. Who am I going to be cast for? Where would you cast me? I was on an audition. This was probably about a year ago, and I'm sitting in a group of people, and we're reading as a group of four, and I look over at this guy who's about probably 32 or something, and I'm listening to his lines, and I'm thinking to myself, I used to be you. I used to be called in for that role. That's not going to happen anymore, and I can't be upset by that. I have to accept the roles that I can. And that is a thing that I find people have trouble with, that they will fight aging as much as they possibly can. And who wants to age, really? Who wants to get older and look closer to the age of dirt? Nobody wants to do that. But if you want to work, you've got to be honest with yourself as far as what you look like and what type of roles would you be suited for. I'm not going to play James Bond. I might play one of the villains, but I'm not going to be Bond. Whether I ever would have been Bond or not is another story. But, where do you fit? You can want to play whatever you want to play, but what are you going to play? And I've had to tell that to people on various occasions. And one student, I remember one time, wasn't getting anywhere. And I said, so do you see yourself around here? Just, what do you mean? I said, well, just look at the locally produced commercials. The locally produced commercials. Do you see yourself in any of those? Your type, your look. And she said, no. And I said, exactly. You have to be in New York. There's no market for you here. So you have to understand where the markets are and be able to go to the places that will best serve you in that regard, whatever that look is. Sometimes you might have to make some adjustments. You might have to get a haircut or let your hair grow, or your hair is styled too wrong, or you've got the wrong headshot. I had a student once that had come in. This was a woman in her early 40s. And there was nothing wrong with the photography on the headshot that she was using. But she said, I get called in a lot, but I don't get the role. And I said, well, that's because you look 10 years older in this photo. I said, it doesn't look like you. You need to get a shot that looks like you look right now, so that when people call you in, when you walk through the door, that's who they're seeing. Some people really put that off. They'll use a headshot that's 10 years younger than what they are now, and then when they come through the door, it's like, who's this? Is this person I called in? I don't think so. So that's the difficult thing, is being honest with yourself and understanding where you will work. Because if you want to work, you got to do that. I have another little seminar that I do on occasion. I don't do it for any of these classes, but it's so if you think this lecture is long, but it's called the 70 Reasons Why You Didn't Get Cast, and subtitles, What You Can Do About It. Well, in 45 of those cases, there's nothing you can do about it. But at least it puts in perspective, because most people will walk out the door thinking, if they didn't get cast, well, I really blew that. There could be 45 reasons why you were good, but some other little thing happened that was the reason why you didn't get cast. You just think, I blew that. And that's not the case at all. And you have to get a better understanding of what you're good at and what you do well, and make proper choices in order to get those roles. You also want to eliminate, and this is the notion of where you hear a lot of different things as far as what works and what doesn't work, sometimes just superstitious. And I've done that. And do I regret it or not? I don't know. Now it makes a good story. I was auditioning for a commercial for a regional car dealership. And I knew I was going to have to be, I got the call back. So I'm at the call back. And I knew I was going to have to be driving, fake driving a vehicle. And I thought, gosh, I hate faking that. That just seems so funny. So I went to a junkyard and got a steering wheel. And I put the steering wheel in a bag, and I went in and I sat down. I pulled the steering wheel out of the bag. Well, they all started laughing, and they said, where did you get that steering wheel? And I said, if you don't mind, I'd really like to get to the audition, because I got to get this on the car, back on the car downstairs before the guy comes back. Anyway, so I did the audition. I did wind up getting the role, got the role cast, and I played in 2 markets. It was, well, that's beside the point. Anyway, I didn't put the steering wheel back in the bag. I walked out with the steering wheel visible to everybody else that was in the room, all the other guys that were waiting to audition. And I could just, I saw the looks on their face, and some of, wanted to borrow it. It was like, oh man, forgot the steering wheel. It was like, please. Think about this in terms of why they're casting someone. Are they casting me because they're going to say, not much of an actor, but he had a steering wheel? No, I don't think that's going to happen. So all those other things that you do or that you try to do, it will never take the place of, can you do the role? Are you suitable for the role? Can you deliver what they want to deliver? Bring whatever you want, dress however you want. None of that's going to matter if you can't act. That's the thing that's most important in the equation. And the second thing is, can they take direction? Because sometimes they might give you some other choice that might seem counterintuitive, but you do it because you show that you can do that. You don't fight them on that. It may be completely wrong, but at least they know that they can work with you. If you can do it there, you're going to be able to do it on set. If you give somebody direction, sometimes we'll do that just to see if they can take direction. And they don't make any change because either they can't or they're fighting you, then they're out. Because why would you want to do that on set? Why would you want to fight that on set? Another thing that I wanted to mention is the idea of thoughts. This has come up recently, so the idea, audiences can't read thoughts. Again, it goes back to the Kuleshov experiment. They can understand things based upon what's just happened or what other images have been juxtaposed to them. They will get that. But they will never get the notion of, if I tell you, well, I want you to think such and such, well, that doesn't mean that it's going to read. Sometimes people react in strange ways. You tell somebody something terrible or tragic that's happened, they start laughing. It's their defense mechanism. It's the way they respond. I want them to react in a particular way. I don't want it to necessarily be honest. I want it to be believable. So I've got to give, if I'm the director or the writer, I've got to give them something. If it's just the idea of a look, I'm going to give them something to do or cut something in there with them so that the audience gets the right message. Because you thinking it, you even feeling it, doesn't mean that it's communicating, which is the other problem that I have sometimes with method performance. In that, if you're feeling something, do I really understand what you're feeling? I mean, just think about that in life. How many times that you've been in the presence of somebody and they're feeling a certain way and you didn't get it. It just didn't come across. It wasn't communicated in some fashion and you missed it. So how can the confusion of that be expressed more readily in acting if the reactions are supposed to be real? You're going to have hit and miss kind of situations. And I don't want hit and miss situations. I want to know specifically what's going to communicate what I need to be communicated. Because there are people, and there's two things I tell, particularly people coming in. I said, there's a wonderful thing and a terrible thing about this business. And the wonderful thing is it can happen for anybody. So, when someone says they have a dream to do this, it's certainly possible. And the terrible thing is it can happen for anybody. I mean, you have people that will study, put a lot of time and effort and work into it, and really not get anywhere, even though they're a tremendous talent. And someone else with very little talent catches on, predominantly because they've got, a personality that people like. I mean, there are certain actors that you'll see, and they make a lot of money. They're not really actors. They're not very talented, but just people enjoy watching them work and seeing what they do. And I'm not going to mention it. You know who I'm talking about. You've got people on your mind right now probably as a result of that. And there's nothing wrong with that. If people want to pay to see that, I'm not knocking that. I'm just sorry for those people with a lot of talent that want to, do something and go somewhere with it. And have never had the opportunity to do that. Of course, you could say, well, you've got to make your own opportunities. But you do have to knock on some doors. So I've given you a lot of information in a very short period of time. And there are, trust me, many, many more stories. But I don't want to go on and on and on about this. I've given you enough to generate some questions for a conference to think about what it is that you want to do. But when you're thinking about talent, watch that Kuleshov experiment, because that will tell you a lot about the process and how significant editing is. Talked early on about editing, how editing can change a performance, which is another issue that I have sometimes with performances. Differing from theater, because we can take, pieces of different takes to create a performance that's really workable and that's probably superior to any one of the individual takes along the way. So, the actor is certainly playing a major contribution in that, but not solely. That's also part of the responsibility of the editor and the director, if they're on board doing that or working together to create that performance. And that's one of the things you have to understand as to how performances are made. Sometimes it's the raw material from the actor themselves, and then the editing process that makes that possible for them to excel. I mean, we've saved some performances in editing that were somewhat of a struggle along the way, and that afterwards sounded pretty darn good as a result of that. So I'm sure that happens a lot.